We're looking up to Leicester on a rather wet day in June, and we're here in the middle of the old town. In fact, this was the very centre of the town from the time of the Romans, and we're standing on what was part of the Roman Forum. But here it's Highcross Street. This was the main north-south road of the town for hundreds of years. In fact, until it was cut in half in the 1950s. If we look down Highcross Street here, we see perhaps the most notable building is the old Free Grammar School. It's the one with the P sign on it, the parking sign, and a P and an arrow underneath it. That was the Free Grammar School, founded in the time of Queen Elizabeth I, with the money from the bequest of Roger Wigston, we'll come to him later, and William Wigston, and also the Earl of Huntingdon. Now, the Free Grammar School, of course, was the Free Grammar School, which later became, in the 19th century, the Wigston School, and we'll also look at that later. It's on the corner of Free School Lane, would you believe it? If you go down further, the camera can perhaps just make out the further end of Highcross Street, down by Northgates and what's known as Frog Island. You can't quite see All Saints Church. That's on the further part, the bit that was cut off by Vaughan Way when it was put through in the 1950s, sadly chopping in half this ancient main arterial route of Leicester. Nearer too, you can see the car just parking there, the green car. That is standing right on the site of the original High Cross of Leicester. The High Cross was just the central point of any town. The sort of place where proclamations were made, you know, the king is dead, long live the king, or there's going to be an election, or something like that. And it was also the place where you'd go if you wanted to meet somebody. You know, today we might say, well, meet you at McDonald's, or meet you somewhere like Lewis's. But in those days, well, meeting you at the High Cross was the obvious thing. It was the place that everybody recognised. And it stood there, rather like a miniature version of the cross at Mount Sorrel, with columns round it. In fact, there's a small picture here. We'll look at that later. And by the early 19th century, it had turned into one single high cross, one single column rather, which stood in the middle of the road. And consequently, of course, the town planners of the day didn't like that very much because it obstructed traffic, and they moved it. Actually, it was moved by the mayor of the old corporation, and he put it in front of his house in the Crescent. And that's where it stood for many years until another mayor, well, he wasn't mayor at the time, but a man called Arthur Wakeley, many of you have heard of Wakeley Road, he was the man who virtually designed and built North Evington. Arthur Wakeley thought it'd be rather nice to have it in his garden, so he moved it to Gwendolen Road in Evington, and there it stood for about 20 years until the mid-1930s. And then it was moved again. This time it was bought by the corporation and put behind the Newark Houses Museum. And then it stood there until the Rotary Club moved it as a gesture for their 50th anniversary, I think it was, to the place where it is now in Cheapside, in the marketplace. Well, now, also down this road, Highcross Street, just behind the yellow truck maintenance lorry, you can see a factory building, this side of the old Free Grammar School. And that's the site of the county jail. County jail built in the late 18th century, designed by a man called Moneypenny, and I believe he was the first, or one of the first people to reside there inside because he couldn't pay his debts. But anyway, the jail there, the county jail, became the town jail when the new county jail, Welford Road, we all know it and love it, on Welford Road was put up in 1828. So the town took over the old county jail, and it stayed there as the town jail until about 1880, something in the 1880s. I think that was as a result of the nationalisation of prisons by the Conservative government of the day. you can see actually a fragment of the old jail building in the wall between that factory and the shops just this side of it. Very nicely restored shops, incidentally, recently refurbished. And then next to that you can see the Red Line Inn when the buses aren't passing. And then you've got a rather interesting building with some nice decoration on the front. It's now called After Dark, and I see it's empty, any takers? But it was in the 19th century, the late 19th century. It was one of our coffee houses. Some of you may know of the other coffee houses. There's a wonderful one near the Clock Tower, the Eastgate's Coffee House, that we saw on the last programme. And this was called the Highcross Coffee House, understandably, and it was one of a dozen of the Leicester Coffee and Cocoa House Company establishments, put up as a sort of deliberate attempt to wean people away from the wicked demon of drink. Because in the 19th century, if you went to work, and you went to work much longer than you do today, none of this knocking off at 3:30, and people had to have somewhere where they could eat their lunch. And of course the pubs were the obvious place, and so of course they had to have drink, because the pubs wouldn't serve food without drink. And the Leicester Coffee and Cocoa House Company was set up in order to provide a sort of practical alternative to that for people who didn't want to let a drop of the hard stuff pass their lips. And it served very good tea, cocoa, coffee, and very wholesome food at sort of penny and tuppence and tuppence halfpenny for a decent sort of sandwich, or, you know, pork pie or something. So it was a place well worth going to. And they were very, very popular. Anyway, that was the Highcross Coffee House until 1922, when it was sold off. The other side of the road, by the way, was in the Middle Ages the site of the Blue Boar Inn, where Richard III spent his last night before he went out to the Battle of Wadsworth and lost his crown and his head and his life and everything else. You know, my kingdom for a horse and all that. The Blue Boar was also, like the High Cross, pulled down for road widening in 1836. Now, if we turn to the other side of the road here, don't know my right from my left, and we see St Nicholas Church just visible through the trees. It's probably the oldest church in Leicester, almost certainly the site of the original Anglo-Saxon bishopric, or see of Leicester, for about 40 years, from 737 to 777 AD, when the Danes came along and sensible people shifted themselves and went off, in this case, to Dorchester-on-Thames, a sleepy little town on the River Thames, which was actually the see of of Leicester for many years, until the time of the Norman Conquest, when Leicester became part of the Bishop of Lincoln's domain. And it stayed under Lincoln, the Anglican Church of Leicester, until the 19th century, when it was transferred to the newly created See of Peterborough. The Bishop of Peterborough then was our bishop until we had our own one, our very own bishop, in 1926. Well, behind St Nicholas Church is the Jury Wall, and that of course is even older, dates back to the Roman occupation, and it was part of the wall of the Roman Forum. The Roman Forum was a very large area. I suppose you'd think of the Town Hall Square and the Shires complex put together for something similar in Roman times. It was the centre of everything that went on in the town of civic importance. And it extended right the way out here over the site of the Holiday Inn and this car park, and around over the top of the underpass. Before the car park was put here in the 1960s, Jean Mellor, the chief archaeologist of the Leicester Museum at the time, supervised a dig here, and they unearthed various Roman remains. Other remains were unearthed in the underpass, in construction of the underpass. Several of these things, like the beautiful Roman wall painting, which is now on display in the Jury Wall Museum. The Holiday Inn, which was built in, I think, the 1970s, was actually built over the top of some of these Roman remains, over the top of, among other things, a Mithraic temple, a Roman temple. And in fact, if you want to know exactly where it is, you can take a dip in the swimming bath of the Holiday Inn, because it's right underneath you. And the Holiday Inn is not my favourite piece of architecture. Maybe one day, when that comes down, we can reopen the dig and Leicester can display this really superb piece of Roman remains. We have, I think, got about the biggest bit of Roman remains in Britain in the Jury Wall. It's the biggest single chunk, and it's part of the Forum complex. In front of that, if you go further away from us now, you come to the site of the Roman baths. And the baths were excavated in the 1930s when it was proposed to build a new swimming bath. Leicester had various swimming baths, Vestry Street, Cossington, Bath Lane, quite a number of others by then, but it was thought it was time we had a new, really nice, modern swimming bath, and where better to put it than down here in this empty space between the railway and the Jury Wall. And they started digging, and hey presto, what did they find but a Roman baths? And the more they dug, the more exciting it became. And then there was a real debate. What should we do? Should we go ahead and build the baths that everybody wants to swim in? Or should we say, no, let these archaeologists, these fuddy-duddy people, have their way and preserve this for posterity? Well, I'm ever so glad they took that view and didn't build a swimming bath there, but instead they waited until St. Margaret's was built long after the Second World War in about 1965. If we turn further, I think, the Jury Wall, by the way, you might wonder why it's called the Jury Wall. There are several explanations. People used to think it was to do with the Jews, maybe a Jewish quarter, but there's no evidence for that. More likely it's to do with the Jurats, who were town councillors who probably met there, and so the Jurats Wall became the Jury Wall. Holy Bones is another name for the area. That probably derives not so much from the bones of saints or anybody, but more from the fact that it was the site also of the shambles, the place where the butchers were in Leicester, and of course they'd had lots of bones. The further round, the other side, if the camera can move round to opposite Highcross Street, we come to, well, you can see the spire of St. Mary de Castro. St. Mary de Castro, another of the great medieval churches of Leicester, and of course it means St. Mary of the Castle, because it's in part of the original castle site built by Hugh de Grandmesnil. He was the great big chief in the time of the Normans and William the Conqueror, and it's next to the great castle hall, which is really a rather splendid medieval hall, and is no longer used by the magistrates, and eventually will be turned into a museum of, I think, medieval times. And many of you will know there's also John of Gaunt's wine cellar there, a rather splendid, actually a wine cellar dating from about 1400. Just, I believe, a year after John of Gaunt died, but never mind. Further round, we come to the Costume Museum. This used to be known as 18 Highcross Street, and it was the home of Roger Wigston, sort of family home of the Wigstons from the late 15th century. Wigston's very important local family. William Wigston was the mayor of the Staple. That was the place where all the wool from England was collected together and sold through the Staple at Calais to the continent, because that, of course, was our main export. Every school boy knows that, and schoolgirl knows that the Lord Chancellor sits on a wool sack because the wealth of England was founded on wool. Anyway, William Wigston's wealth was certainly founded on it. He was the sort of chief executive of the crown, if you like, at Calais, and by far the richest man in Leicester. So his house is rather special. The front of it, of course, is much later. It's an 18th century front, But the medieval back part of it, with the lovely half timbering, dates from, as I say, the late 15th century, and in that wall, the windows once had beautiful stained glass, and this stained glass has survived. Remarkably, it survived. Most stained glass was smashed during the Reformation, the Puritan Revolution, etc. But somehow this glass survived. Perhaps because it's not actually ecclesiastical, but more likely because it was covered over, deliberately covered over by a past owner, plastered over so that nobody would know it was there. And it was rediscovered and is now in the Jury Wall Museum. And it's probably the most precious piece of exhibit in the whole of the museum, because so far as I know, it's quite unique in being so old and being non-ecclesiastical. It isn't actually from a church, it's from a domestic house. And it shows people, partly people of the Wiggiston family, they've actually been identified as individuals that we can put names to. Anyway, the Wiggiston house was threatened with demolition even as late as the 1960s. People said it was in the way of road improvements, etc. Fortunately, it was kept. It was retained and altered to be this very fine museum of the city of Leicester. Nearby is Carey's Close, and Carey was the great Baptist missionary to India, and his cottage was here until, again, the building of the underpass, and so much of this area was just felled then to put the new road through. This little part of Highcross Street, alongside the Costume Museum, is now called Applegate. It wasn't Applegate, it was Highcross Street, and then it joined onto Southgate Street. But on Applegate now we can see the Wiggiston Boys' School, which is now the Leicester Grammar School, and that was founded again with some of the money from William Wiggiston in his will, and the money had incidentally grown over the years because he left land in the Coalville area, and during the 19th century coal was dug and was very, very necessary for the steam engines, the railways, and so it became very, very valuable. More money came into the charity, and they were able to put up not only this great new school, but also a new hospital for old people. A hospital didn't mean a place where they were treated for ailments, rather it was rather like an old people's home. And the old people's home meant, of course, they pulled down the original. Oh, what a terrible crime! These Victorians were dreadful, pulling down anything they thought was old and out of fashion and in the way. And so they pulled down probably one of the best, if not the best, medieval building in Leicester. And you can see where it was on the corner of the playground of the present grammar school. There's a little plaque saying this is where St Ursula's Chapel stood, the chapel of Wiggiston Hospital. Later on in the 19th century, in 1884, the extension, which is the technical school wing of the Wiggiston Boys' School, was put up in memory, rather sadly, in memory of the son of Edward Shipley Ellis. He was, by the way, one of the people who pulled down the school, because he was the treasurer of the Wiggiston Foundation at the time. Canon Vaughan of Vaughan College was the other wicked man who, was chairman, agreed to the felling of the old Wiggiston Hospital. But he put up this technical school to the memory of his son. Edward Shipley Ellis's son died when he was conducting chemical experiments in a shed behind his house, which used to stand on the site of the De Montfort University in the Newark. Further round here, we've got Guildhall Lane, and if we look down Guildhall Lane, we see, of course, the Guildhall, which is, yet again, a wonderful medieval building, and behind that is the Cathedral of St Martin. Though it's been much mucked about, these Victorians again put up a new spire and altered quite a bit of it. But the Guildhall was the seat of the town government right from Middle Ages up until 1876, when the new town hall was built. And then they wanted to pull it down, but I'm glad to say that wiser counsels prevailed. The editor of the Mercury at the time, a chap called James Thompson, was a very great historian and archaeologist, and he said, no, don't pull it down, and it was saved, and it became the School of Cookery. And that, of course, eventually became the School of Domestic Science. Well, now, on the other side of Guildhall Lane, you can see the restaurant, the Hello Canton, and next to it, the Antiques Complex. Well, you can't quite see it, actually, because the lettering has gone, but it's the building that's under offer and for sale. And what I want you to look at is the decoration on the front, those tiles, and also the doorway. The doorway to the building, which was originally a provision merchant's warehouse. And the provision merchants were Swain, Almond and Latchmore. And that's why you can see S, A and L in this ironwork on the gate. Now, the building was actually designed by somebody called Francis Drake, would you believe it? Not the chap that sailed around the world, but a 19th century architect of that name in 1861. And so those tiles and the gate and much of the building date from 1861. And it's shortly going to be transformed into yet another eating place, restaurant in Leicester. Behind it's even more interesting to the archaeologists because it's actually got a medieval, complete medieval cellar under the floor. And I think from there we'll take a break and go and see what we can see of these items in the Jury War Museum and in the Costume Museum.